9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 7. Reawakening Those Lost. With the next morning came a tension in the misty air. 9 was standing outside, alone, in a clearing nearby, the slain ragdolls laying in a circle. He was standing beside 5's body, he slightly shaking hands holding the talisman closely to his chest. He was staring at the sky into the dark, gray, ominous clouds. 9 then closed his eyes and bowed his head, silently praying that this was somehow going to work. The air was damped, and it was very cold, but he hardly cared. He kept running his fingers over the talisman, still debating on whether or not to do this. He knew dead was forever. Bringing back a soul, let alone 5, was never supposed to occur. Then again, if they were trapped, he was going to be able to give them back the lives they were meant to live. Perhaps this would make up for what he had done. He knew he had to at least try. But before he carried out the task, he heard the sound of soft footsteps on the dew-covered ground behind him. Turning around, 9 saw 7 and the twins come up to him. "You don't have to do this alone," 7 said, softly. Standing beside him and putting a hand on his shoulder, he smiled at her gratefully, and she returned it. 4 and 3 both reached out around their sister with a hand and gently pushed the talisman into 9's chest, urging him to go on. He smiled softly back at him, affection of the 2 little ones filling his uncertain heart. Looking down at the talisman, he could clearly picture the sequence 5 had shown him. Taking a deep breath, 9's fingers hovered over the first key for a moment. Then he pressed it. The symbol immediately began to glow, reflecting in their optics. All 4 of them tensed, hearts pounding. 9 then pressed the second key, hoping beyond hope. And finally, the last. There was a silent pause that seemed to last forever. The talisman began to shake violently in his hands. 9 didn't try to hold it. He placed it on the ground, nearly dropping it, and stepped back. The talisman burst open, with a crackle of electricity, and slowly glowed eerily. The light illuminated the morning around them. It hummed for a moment, then suddenly a green light erupted into the air. It was a single thin tower of light coming from the plates from the symbols. 9 was nearly knocked backward with the force of the beam from the light. As he stumbled, 7 caught him in his arms. There was a sound like thunder as the talisman hummed mechanically. The light pierced through the clouds. The 4 stared up at the sky, astonished. Then 5 green lights came from up above the clouds. They united with the beam of light spiraling down the tower as it seemed to retrieve from the sky. 9 could only watch in shock, eyes wide. The shaft of life then withdrew slowly back into the talisman. The device, however, didn't close. As the beam of light widened, it was still up for a moment. Then a figure slowly rose and stepped out from the talisman. The spirit of 6, grinning widely at the 4 survivors. 9 gasped softly, unable to help the wide smile that appeared on his lips. It had really worked. He felt a hand on his shoulder as he glanced at 7, who looked just as happy as he was. They both looked back at the seer. He raised his hand, waving enthusiastically at the 4. All 4 of them raised their hands and waved back, overjoyed to see the artists once more. He beamed into the light that surrounded them, and seemed to glow brighter. 6 then walked up to 9 and curiously peered up into his face. The spirit seemed to be contemplating something, for his wide eyes searched his face for something. The young Stitchpunk blinked, raising his brows in surprise. 6 then smiled at 9 softly, seemingly satisfied with his thoughts. Then he turned around and walked along the circle, looking for his body, at a peace with the world around him. 9, 7, 3, and 4 turned their attention back to the talisman. The light widened when further. A large figure rose out from it. 8 looked down at them, a bit cynically. Then he grinned softly and gave a grateful nod to 9 before turning away and looked to find his own body. The next figure rose out from it. Sinister eyes narrowed, and his gaze at 9 and 7. 1 walked towards them slowly, expression impassive. He then gave a small smile with a single brief wave. 9 bowed his head, giving a single nod, then raised his hand as well. 7 gave him a brief nod for acknowledgement, while the twins gave him inactive smiles from behind the 2 adults. 1 watched them for a moment, then turned away, hands held behind his back as if he was taking some sort of contemplative stroll. They looked back at the talisman to see 2 ascend. Smiling, Knight's heartbeat quickened as he locked eyes with the older man, who could only beam widely. The first man to die because of his mistakes gave him a proud smile. His eyes shined. 9 then couldn't help but smile back, relieved to see the old inventor once again. He then looked to the talisman as the last figure rose out of the light. 2 slowly stepped aside to let him ascend freely. 5, humble as docile as ever, looking up to the Savior, smiling warmly. 9 froze as he looked upon his friend. He blinked once in surprise, and 5's happy grin became wider. He then began to slowly approach the young man. 9 remained fixed to the spot, but 7 took the twins' hands as they stepped aside, allowing 5 to come to the shocked Stitchpunk. He opened his mouth, trying to find something to say. There was so much he wanted to tell 5. His friend deserved every single apology in the universe for how much pain he had caused him. But he was so ashamed, he could only whisper, "Oh, 5, I'm so sorry." 5 peered closely to him, brow furrowed in worry. 9 bowed his head and closed his eyes tightly, feeling hollow inside, shameful, unable to look 5 in the eyes. Then he felt a single icy chill shoot through his arm. He looked up as the spirit laid a hand on his shoulder. 5 gave him a forgiving smile, and was forgiving the way 5 gave his shoulder a small squeeze. He then turned away from 9 and kneeled beside his body. His form was laying on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, his face peaceful and vacant. 9 stepped back slowly as 5 examined his mended body. He rendered forward and gently touched his new eye patch with his fingertips. It was leather and sewn on securely. His grin became even wider, and he looked up at 9, giving a small nod of appreciation. He watched him, hoping that he had done everything right. Suddenly, time itself seemed to slow. The 5 souls rose into the sky somewhat, levitating their own bodies. Glistening particles surrounded their glowing forms. 9, 7, and the twins watched in awe as they seemed to turn into wisps of smoke, and they entered their bodies through the eyes and mouths. The bright green glow surrounded their bodies as they were lifted into the air, rotating slowly. Light emanated from their eyes and mouths as the souls re-entered their bodies. The glow seemed even brighter as the 5 Stitchpunks hung into the air, hanging over the 4 who watched in complete astonishment. Then the light disappeared completely. Glowing particles evaporated into the air as the bodies were lowered to the ground gently. Each lay down softly as the talisman closed, the symbols no longer glowing. Everything was still and silent. The wild phenomenon came to a close. 9 watched from apprehension. Everything seemed quiet as the 4 Stitchpunks anxiously looked over the 5 that should have come back. 9 took a hesitant step towards 5, watching him closely. The one-eyed ragdoll didn't move at all. He remained completely still, single eyes staring blankly upwards, no sign of life whatsoever. Knight's heart fell as he looked on, knowing that it hadn't worked. He was never going to see them again. And then, Five's buttoned chest rose slightly and fell. A moment passed as his chest rose again, and Five gasped sharply. His eyes snapped shut, and he fought for breath. Gasping slowly, Nine gasped, almost unable to believe it. The older Stitchpunk began to move his limbs slowly, as if trying to tell him out for the first time again. His breathing slowed for more than rhythm as he seemed to relax. His eye opened again slowly, glowing a bright green before dissolving into its normal black. He then struggled to sit up, giving a weak groan. Quickly, Nine rushed forward and grabbed his arm, helping him to sit up. As Five sighed, rubbing the side of his head, Nine stepped back, almost not wanting to believe it. This couldn't have been really happening. This was just a dream. And when he couldn't wake up. Five opened his eyes again and looked up. His face broke into a wide smile as he caught sight of Nine.
You did it. I knew you could,
he exclaimed happily, trying to get to his feet. His entire form shook with weakness. Nine came forward to help him up to unsteady feet. Five was still smiling at him, who was overcome with joy, but still felt confused and ashamed.
Five, you should have never,
he stammered before shaking his head and sighing softly.
I missed you. It's all over. It's just a memory,
he said gently. He nodded wordlessly, closing his eyes. Five understood what Nine was trying to say, and he wrapped his arms around his best friend, hugging him with a fierce compassion. Nine blinked and stared forward, shocked. His arms hung uselessly at his sides, and he could hardly believe it. After all he's done, after all the pain he caused Five, the older man who embraced him like a brother, he was here now. He was really here. An overwhelmed wave of emotion crashed over Nine, and with a cock sobbed, he finally returned the embrace. His fingers gripped Five tightly as he let his head to fall and rest on his shoulder. All the emotion within Nine overwhelmed him, broke his heart, and mended all the same. He buried his face into Five's shoulder, closing his eyes tightly as the older Stitchpunk rubbed his friend's numbered back tenderly. Nine couldn't even begin to describe how remarkable the feeling of forgiveness felt. Five had forgiven him for his mistakes. He could ask for nothing more in those moments as he welcomed his best friend back into the world.
I was afraid it wouldn't work,
Nine said softly.
Breed slightly hitched. It's good to have you back, bud. It's good to be back,
the mechanic said with a chuckle. The two withdrew and faced one another. Five clapped Nine on the shoulder, smiling widely before replying gently.
I missed you too. Now come on. I'm not the only one who wants to see you.
Nine beamed felt a familiar hand on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself looking to the mismatched eyes of Six.
Hello, Six,
he said, looking down at the bandaged Stitchpunk. Six grinned widely, looking happier than Nine had ever seen him.
We're back. We're home,
Six said softly. Nothing but pure joy emanated from his resurrected form.
Yeah, I can see that.
He chuckled as Six gave a breathy little laugh, then went to greet Five. Seven and the twins were reunited with their friends as well, happily hugging and patting backs, carefully talking. Nine smiled softly at Seven, who caught his gaze. Her smile widened even further as she looked at him. Then, went back at greeting her friends. He sighed contently, relieved to see her truly happy again. He then nearly stumbled as 8 gruffly patted his back with his one enormous hand. He rubbed his shoulder and grinned nervously up at the bodyguard. "Hi, 8," he said up to the large stitch punk, who grunted at his greeting, but offered a small smile. Then turning, he saw 2's old, frail figure walking up to him, opening his arms and smiling wide. 9's lips trembled as he smiled again, walking back to meet the inventor. For a slight moment, 9 hesitated in raising his own arms. 2 immediately enfolded him in a tender embrace, patting his back shortly. The young man then hugged his very first friend back, a short warm glow filling his whole body. "Thank you, my friend. Thank you," 2 said softly. 9's eyes met his own, which were filled with life and warmth. "Friend," he repeated, speaking the first word he'd ever said to 2. The old stitch punk beamed up at him. 9 then felt a hand on his shoulder, releasing 2 and turning around and saw 1, the first stitch punk, who was actually smiling at him, his sinister eyes soft. "Well done, 9," he said quietly. 9 gave him a smile in return. He couldn't believe it. This was truly happening. This was real. "Thank you, 1," 9 replied. He looked at each of the face of his clan, who were now 9 once more. Everyone was still smiling, and the air wondered to settle around them. The morning suddenly felt much warmer and less wet. Even though the mist had shown no signs of letting up, 9 didn't care at all. He was beside himself with joy. His friends were back, and his kinsmen were reunited. He'd fixed his mistake, and now life could go back to the way it was. Quiet and peaceful. It was really real. End of chapter 7.